Okay, cool.
So yeah, this is using building query for February 26th. But I think we'll let the conversation flow into a couple topics. One, whatever's on Abe's mind, and then two, catching Rob up on Qrimatic. So B5, you spoke to Abe.
Yeah, Abe, you were mentioning a use case around using query to Python in a Next.js serverless function. Would you mind shedding any light on that, or do you have anything here? Are you mainly in the planning phases of that?
I have like a working app, and to be clear, it's a hobby project, so it's not part of my professional life. Disclaimer. But the goal, it's kind of like a stats, and now like a stats viewer for gaming application, and so the stats are stored in JSON, and every time you play the game, the stats are updated. So there's always one singular file that is the source of truth for the stats, but unless you snapshot that file when you play, then you can't really, track the progress through the game. And it could be like for one player or as many players as you want. And so right now, because it's just me and my friends, I've been manually snapshotting, and then I'm actually storing those JSON files in the repo for this project. And that's all fine because we're not addicted to video games, so we only play like once every week or once every 2 weeks. But I've been like, checking in with your project now and then, and I started to get this idea, well, since those files are really just versions of the same data set over time, it makes a lot of sense that I could just commit them every time they change, and then query would sort of manage that process. And I could even go so far as to use the log as the list of game sessions, I guess you could call them. And that was what drove my question in Discord today about the diff command, because I do a lot of manual stuff to calculate the diffs between the files every session. I'm working on like basic diffs between values. All the values are numeric, so it's very simple. You just like take the latest one, take the previous one, and like subtract, and you have your diff for the values. So yeah, long story short, I'm like working towards this thing, and I also think it would be valuable for other people. And so I've been thinking about ways to make it generally available so that it's not just me like on a server running this, and it's something that anyone could do. And that's kind of where I guess like the Next.js thing is more of a situation that like I'm obsessed with Next.js and can't stop using it. And I'm not a big fan of custom backends and APIs. So I try to do everything possible to just use serverless functions for everything that I do. And so I thought it'd be cool if there was like some sort of lightweight service that you could throw on the game server that was doing the snapshotting, that was either using the query CLI directly, or it was sort of sending the data to my Next.js serverless function that catapulted it into query. And that's kind of where I'm at. Like, I work on it a little bit each week, but I realize it's not, super business priority or anything like that, but it's been fun to think about. And I'm now even more intrigued because I think query might have exactly what I'm looking for.
That's fantastic. This is super fun. Yeah, I think there's a bunch. You're kind of getting, I can shoehorn what you said into an automation thing, because we're on a big automation sort of stint these days. And so some of what we're going to be showing Rob may actually be relevant to what you're saying, or to what you're sort of trying to do. Some of the other stuff that I think would be relevant to your particular challenge, given that you're trying to do everything in Next.js serverless. Queries obviously go binary. One of the things we've been playing with a little bit has been taking pieces of our code base and compiling them to WebAssembly. And that has been very early, and we're currently just working on this Starlark syntax, which actually allows you to parse Python in the browser. which we want to use for a syntax highlighter that we'll show you in a bit. But there are some like, there could be some fun avenues of pursuit if I'm understanding correctly that the Next.js serverless environment is a single function in Node. And so you basically need a JavaScript execution environment. But you'd mentioned Python in your sort of brief overview in the chat. So just want to know how the languages interplay there so that we can get the what's possible right.
Yeah, so I don't think a lot of people are aware, but Next.js does support 4 different languages for their serverless functions. They support Node, but they also support Go, they support Python, and I believe they support Ruby.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Now, I've never used the other 3 because I like to keep things simple, but when I see a tool like Query that's only available in Python, then I was like, well, this would be a good chance to try that out. And so I haven't tried it yet, but I can't even get I'm having like Next.js problems at this point. I can't even get to that point, but I think it could work. So I don't know.
Totally. Yeah, and so there's one warning I would give you there in that when we talk about query operating in Python, it's generally a query library, a Python package that is calling to a binary. And the binary is written, in our case, in Go and compiled to an executable. And so the Python package is actually just wrapping that library and talking to it. And so I would love to make sure before we send you on a rabbit, dog and pony chase, that it's possible to either embed the binary or use the other sort of mode we want to operate the query Python package in is through an API. So it just allow you to talk to a service, which could be a server that you're running as a remote. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be Query Cloud, but it defaults to Query Cloud in that context. So when we're in the serverless function land, often I'm pretty sure we don't have access to a file system, or if we do, it's like cursory and quite ephemeral, which would mean like, now you have to like spin the function up, load the binary, fire the binary. That may actually create pretty significant latency, but that's latency may be acceptable in your use case, but there might be other ways to do it.
Well, it kind of ties into the second question I had about this, which, that's like one way to do it. You could also just, like I said, have the query stuff happen on the game server itself. That's like a dedicated machine that would make far more sense in some case. But the thing that I maybe don't understand is if I wanted to, I've got like my SciRobot namespace and query, but if I was going to launch some kind of service for this where other people had their game data hosted, I could either make a dedicated account and have a namespace for that, or I guess there's a scenario where each account has their own namespace, and I don't really know how I would manage that, and I don't know if you have thoughts on how someone would do that, or if you've seen people that have done that for other projects.
Absolutely. We're actually, this is the thing that we're working on, like literally this minute. We started referring to this as just multi-tenancy, and the notion of, okay, you have right now almost every query node in the so query nodes exist. You can run it as a server yourself. You have SciRobot, you have datasets over here, datasets over there. There's a one-to-one relationship between the peer or the profile or the user. Let's use the word user, because that's the least confusing word. There's one-to-one relationship between the user and a repository, right? So if you run query locally or you run query on a server, there's only one person. And what we want to be able to do is say any number of people can use that same running process, that same query node, to make as many data sets as we want. And we want that creation to be not necessarily tied back to a service like Query Cloud. So it should be possible for you to run your own service that is effectively spinning up for every user that gets created. The way that we would translate that into query parlance is there would actually be a key pair created for that user and managed by that node. And they would get their own namespace. And that namespace could completely collide with Query Clouds in the sense that you don't have to worry about, hey, does this username, is it taken or not taken, type stuff. And so you just basically get your own universe to play in. And you would be able to assign you say, do this as this user, do this as that user on the invocation of the command if you're using the command line or through the API. And so that's actually, I don't know who wants to speak to the pain of this challenge. Dustin, do you want? But we've been working on this a whole bunch to try and make that possible. So that's in the very near-term roadmap, being able to just basically separate everything out as you need, and then delegate collaboration permissions between those profiles as you need. Does that help? I mean, it's forthcoming stuff, but it's stuff that we're actively working on that we'll be launching this quarter.
Yeah, that's fine. I won't have more than one user for the foreseeable future, so I think it'll be okay.
It's often where things start, and then it's amazing how fast you end up needing, like, been talking with many query users. There are like a number of folks who have not just devs, but like who work on query, but actual users who have like, this data set really kind of belongs in this official account for this thing or this, and that's the common place where this really comes up, is like folks who have a work context and a home context, or and that's where you really just want to have multiple users. Cool, that's really interesting. That we should definitely, I know it's a side project, but like it's a really fun use case that some of what we'll sort of demo to Rob today, or to you as well if you want to stick around, Dave, surrounds a lot of this automation stuff, and how can we make a lot of that work of reacting, setting up things like webhooks that'll allow you to sort of power this stuff together, but also adding in logic that allows you to transform that data on the way in, and then create data sets that form graphs, basically can import other data sets and build upon them. To give a little bit of preamble, and I'm shifting gears here now, Rob, thank you for joining us. We're going to be asking you, Rob has agreed to be put in the hot seat for like questions about use cases and whatnot. But it's a new year, and Query's been rocking along steadily. Query Cloud has been working and up and running for a year now, which has been very fun, and blows my mind to this date that that's still a thing. And we're sort of working on the next set of features that we think will make Query more useful for folks. And we've really taken aim at, we took a look over like the way people have used Query for the last year, and realized that one of the biggest, and did a bunch of interviews and came to the conclusion that one of the biggest challenges folks have is data doesn't feel as useful if it's not fresh. Specifically, if someone isn't taking the time or taking the effort to do things like what you're doing. A number of other folks are like using GitHub Actions to connect to stuff, or using cron jobs and CI workflows to set up stuff for their own server that is just set up with a cron table, and it's like just always a one-off solution. But basically, to make Query like truly useful and to make it produce data that is as useful as possible, somebody has to go to the effort of wiring up some kind of automation to keep that data up to date. When there is an automation, Chris has experienced this every week, where he manually updates the turnstile data set every Monday. That has become one of our more dependent on data sets inside of Query.
Every Monday since 3 Mondays ago.
Right, when we got really busy. And then someone jumped in chat and asked for an update. And so that's been the thing that we've really been trying to focus on, is how can we make Query optionally take over the automation of a data set and do that work for you. We've long had a scripting environment built into Query and the notion of a transform, which is a special component of our data set that lets you bind data to code, a data set to a single piece of code that spits out an updated version of that data set. We use a special programming language for that is modeled as a subset of Python. It's called Starlark. And the reason for that is it's an embeddable language. And so it turns Python-looking code into something that we can run without a container in a relatively secure environment and in a relatively lightweight fashion, because there's no container. And so this year, we're going to be spending a whole bunch of time sort of like building out a better experience for composing these transform scripts, building a set of tools for automating them, and integrating those sort of automations with both inbound data sources. So like, hey, I have this new update to this JSON file, hit a webhook, have that run through a transform script that maybe does nothing, but maybe also seats data in the right place, spits out a minor report for you on like, this column that you care about more. This is how it works. or sorry, this is how it works. That might give you more information and makes the sort of diffing domain specific. And then spits out a new version of that. And so you get an automated updated version and allows you to react to that, saying the first example we're working on is just like send an email, give everybody a quick diagnostic that a new version of that data set is available. And ideally, this is really sort of making the amount of data that any single person can manage larger. And so we're skewing more technical. The folks who are using this generally are expected to know how to write Python. But it's ideally allowing those highly technical users to support many more folks who are dependent on the data sets that they're producing. And so that's sort of how we're hoping to sort of advance the little ecosystem that we started properly working on a year ago. So with that, Rob, do you mind if I just quickly share screen and demo? But actually, before that, any questions off the top on that?
No, none off the top. I'd love to see more concretely and more in action what you're talking about. So
totally
go for it.
Show him what he wants to see. Show them.
Of course. Let's do it.
Give the people what they
want. I'm going to hit this share screen button. Hopefully it functions. Do you see this? Well,
data sets.
Data sets that update themselves.
Data sets that update themselves.
This is where we're at in terms of development. So this is just a very quick splash page, but I'll quickly walk you through the demo just from the beginning, and hopefully this will help clarify what we're thinking. So try query now for us. In the past, we're just going to immediately dump you into a template screen and get you started with a script that will actually do something. And the theory here is you don't know our environment, you don't know what this is and how this works. And so we'll just click CSV download because that's the only one we've coded up. But what that does is drop us into an admittedly sort of like dense screen, but we have just off the top, we have this main area on the right, which is triggers, things that can kick this workflow off. You're looking at a workflow editor, by the way. The actual script itself, which is divided into cells that can be collapsed. And we'll get more into these in a second. And then on completion, what do you want to do when this is done? The general workflow that we're hoping to work with. Oh yeah, we can also click these wonderful things to sort of scroll through them as they go. If we want to just quickly dry run this, this dry run button just allows us to do quick iteration. And so this is running the script, not creating new versions. It's just sort of testing things out for us. And so in this case, we're obviously starting with a demo script that doesn't do a whole lot of anything. We are just not doing anything in the setup step, not doing anything in the download step, but in the transform script, we're just setting the body to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And here we have the actual body itself. And so just to prove that this is actually running code, I can do ds set meta title. I'm a data set. Try run. Oh, well, we can also have compilation errors, which is nice. But
I think you just need to delete your indent and then indent again, or maybe indent with spaces instead of a tab.
Yes. Let's try that. That's better.
Yeah.
Our tabs versus spaces pickup is. Thank you. So we get a really quick and simple display of this. But the big sort of change over this is we can say, hey, I want to run this every hour. And so right at the gates, if we actually hit this deploy button, we get something that is going to automatically check itself every hour. If this thing runs and detects no changes because the data set is version controlled, it'll just spit out in an activity feed, hey, there are no changes. And so for an example of that, let's look at, this is a data set that I've been working on for some time. You're gonna have to ignore this is gonna load a million things really quickly. But once that's done, are you working? Are you alive? Please be alive, demo gods. Oh no, I've broken it. Okay, we'll use a different one. My computer is not happy with me today. Oh yes, we also have discarding changes support, which has been very nice. But how do I actually? Oh yes, I have to log in first, don't I? 5. There we go. Now I click this, this will take me to the dashboard. Now, if I go to my collection, and we actually now get a much more What is going on here? Sorry, 1 second. Oh, yes. Does anybody know how to, Rob, this is an Apple question. I switched to Big Sur and I now get too many open files and I don't know how to up my file limit in this newfangled operating system and it's killing me.
Did you use ulimit?
I did. I don't know. Anyways, I'm not gonna waste everyone's time. Here's the guts of query running. And the thing that's exciting about it is we're actually are executing. Query is actually running these in the background for me and constantly checking for new updates, trying to run data sets as they are on a scheduler. So there's a scheduler existing in the background here. So now when I reload this collection view and I finally don't have too many open files, I'm going to re-log in here. But I will get, okay, thank you. These are actually my data sets. Man, what is going on with this collection? But we actually have like a nice display of, hey, what's been going on with my data over any given amount of time. And ideally, this will be our sort of command and control source, or if we want to, I can just come in and manually rerun this data set right here if I just want the update right now. But I can also get a sort of feed of what's been changing with this data set over time. Yes, I know. And we can actually see that this ran. This is actually real data running where I say, cool, 3 days ago, we actually did this and created a version. And then this data set has not managed to update itself every time it's run since, mainly because the script itself is not wildly interesting. And so as this happens, we can sort of set that up to when something does change, emails go out, versions get pushed to public, things are happening the way that they should. And when things don't work, we get big red error symbols, very similar to the CI. And that can tell us, hey, your script broke, something's wrong. And we can send a different email to a different person when that happens. Not like rocket science stuff, but the things that we think are really exciting about this is by using the Starlark syntax, we actually you don't need containers for this. So we're not pulling around, many gig images just to run Python code. We are planning a support for the full Pandas data frame API. Everybody we talked to was just do Pandas point for point. And so that's what we're sort of is slated for completion towards the end of this quarter. By completion, I mean getting the first sort of 5 to 10 methods in a proper data streaming API up and running. But it gives us a lot of tools we need to sort of like help create a purpose-built tool for scaling the number of data sets we can manage. Even in early playing with this, I've been able to sort of like finally keep data sets up to date that I've never been able to keep up to date. Hopefully I can actually show you this preschools workflow this time. Because it's definitely been a lot easier to sort of actually work on data sets using this editor and then have that data. Once I get it up and running once, I just leave it alone and let it sort of come back to me. Oh yes, so it's finally loaded. This is what I meant by and so here we actually have a manual edit for the thing and actual version creation on each one. And so,
Are you actually making manual edits here?
Yeah, this is real. And so I was trying to update this data set from I wrote a buggy version of query that generated like 1,000 data set steps while I was working on it.
I see. But it looks like you have a script running in 85 years.
Yes. Oh, in the back, these dates are off. Again, this is data that is weird Brendan data because this is me building a version control system in real time with erroneous timestamps in it that failed.
It's just like forging the history.
I used a binary that was not dividing nanoseconds properly. If anyone's really interested in knowing, so time is relative in the data set in this data set's history. But all of these then have all of the same properties that query data sets currently have. So these are all version data that lives on IPFS. That is, when you move it around, it's actually a backup and has the sort of like nice deduplicative properties of being Raven chunked and cut up into blocks as it's going. And so, yeah, it's kind of where we're at. Do you have thoughts, Rob? Do things that strike you right at the gates?
I mean, it looks really cool. I have a few questions, like right off the bat, just to make sure I'm understanding what's going on. And I guess the first is, I'm assuming, but I want to make sure I'm getting this, that is the environment I'm working in when I'm editing stuff and setting up like the scripts or whatever you're calling them in this context that are going to run on a schedule. Is that basically, am I just editing like the Starlark or Skylark transform scripts in the version? So all the same things about versioning of the data set that have always applied around that stuff continue to apply?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all this is a fancy editor for the transform component.
Gotcha.
And we have added support for steps. We didn't talk a lot about steps, but the big advantage or the big difference between what we're calling steps and what would be a cell in, say, a Jupyter Notebook is they have a purpose to them. So in this case, this is the setup step where you do actually have to declare your imports formally. And that's where Query actually builds a dependency graph. So if I load data sets here, I can get a new trigger that says anytime a data set I depend on changes, please rerun yourself. Same thing, the download step is actually, again, purpose-built, both for security reasons and for better output. So in this case, this script is really large, but this download step is doing a bunch of fetching from parkslopeparents.com and actually setting up a bunch of HTML processing to create a data set of existing preschools in my area. And we want to have scripts that can download but not upload generally. And so in this moment, you have two things that'll show up. The download step will show you a much richer output when you're actually running this in the workflow editor. Not yet, but eventually we'll show you every HTTP request that's happening, how long it's taking, that kind of stuff in the actual output of the cell itself, sort of right here while it's running. The other thing we'll do is we turn on HTTP access for the download step and then we turn it off. And so you basically can make your requests, get them kicked off, and then you do, once all your HTTP work is done, then you can get access to, for example, private data sets or stuff that you're using in other contexts. And we can sort of like make it a little easier to design scripts that don't have as many sort of like security scares, as it were, because this is code that can be moved around and executed in other places. And so we want to be careful about that. In the future, we're hoping to introduce other step types like validation steps that will give you like this, hey, cool, I want to validate that this, I want to design a very like logic driven, this must not exceed that, or I want to understand how much this changed in relation to that. That is domain specific. And so Abe, in your example, if you want to really understand how much a specific numeric value is changed in relation to a prior iteration of your version, you can set up a validation step that is going to give you a nicer output of what that might look like. We've tried to do this in the past with JSON schema stuff, and it's just never been enough to sort of make for real validation. But yeah, so it's basically just Starlark scripts. We're just editing them, attaching them. Every time you create a new version, you're actually binding the latest version of that data set. That's what this new deploy button does. The deploy button does two things at once. It creates a new version of the data set with your updated code, and it schedules it with the scheduler. And so it activates all of these sort of triggers.
Gotcha. I think in the, like, this thing that jumps out at me about this just being the same standard transform scripts is that in trying to make this a easier to comprehend and access environment, like I'm thinking through, like when you were looking at the activity history of the data set, I'm assuming probably what I'm seeing in there most of the time is when it says manual edit, that means somebody has probably edited the script as opposed to something else going on. But I'm not sure if that's totally true. And I think like in this environment, the thing that jumps out at me is a really useful thing to clarify and keep track of is the points at which the script and the process that's happening has changed versus like the script ran and updated data.
No, it's a really good point. Yeah, and we should clarify that manual edit means any change that was done by a user by hand. And so we distinguish between automated, which will be this success symbol. And then if, for example, you just updated the README, that would be a manual edit. But we don't distinguish between like a manual edit that changed the transform script. That we could surface. We're planning on having, basically you can click this and get the change report on exactly what changed. So cool, here's success. And then you can see, all right, this, the meta component is the only thing that's different. And here's the line diff of that.
This also isn't surfaced in the app right now, but we're planning on pulling much of the data set editing that we have in desktop into this environment as well. So there are multiple ways for you to manually edit something. And there will be example, like it should connect a little bit easier because you're not only editing scripts. You will be able to edit the data set manually like you do on desktop.
This demo is going so great. so many non-TypeScript transpilation errors.
Brendan, can you remind me does it register as a manual change to the data set if you deploy a workflow but do not run it?
Right now, you can't not run it. Eventually, you'll be able to not run it. And that, I think, will be a manual edit. So the question there is, when you click the deploy button, do you want to just save the updated transform script, or do you want to actually execute the transform scripts when you save in the same commit, which is a really confusing thing that crops up when you bind code to data and put it into version control. But so for now, we're just telling everyone, every time you deploy, it reruns it, and you might get a new version. Well, you're definitely going to get a new version, but you might get new data as well.
Right, you're going to get a new version that at 100% will have a new version because you changed the transform script, but might not have new body because the data is the same, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Abe, in your use case, what we could do is set this up such that there's a webhook on one end and you just hit it with your JSON data. And that thing can take it, optionally do additional processing with this Python syntax, and then send that somewhere else, or keep it in it as a data store and just hang on to it locally and serve that up as is necessary. But that's sort of the hope, is that you get, from that, you could also get emails out of that. You could get whatever is sort of like useful as part of that process. But part of the hope is like to make something a little more automatable. We've talked to other folks who really want to wire this up to GitHub Actions. We've talked to other folks who want this to come out of the end of Apache Airflow. A couple of other like different techniques and tools for like, just, hey, I need pretty much exactly what that thing spits out, but with like these 2 columns geocoded, or with this one thing turned into a different depth floating precision, or please join this with another table and turn that into another data set. Have been a lot of the use cases we see.
Yeah, one thing I was going to add about my particular use case is that I don't really want to have a set cron interval, in the sense that by and large the data just sits there unless you're playing the game. And so this is like part of my inexperience with backend services, and like trying to identify like what constitutes a game session. Like we do know that there's 0 players in the game, and then all of a sudden there's 3 players, and then after an hour it goes back to 0. And so that's the kind of event that I need to detect in order to determine when I want to do the snapshot. So I could a naive approach, like every like 5 minutes or something, but the amount of data is just unnecessary for what I wanted to do. So I don't think it's like it may not be a good use case to build into this, because obviously I don't know how you do that, but I just wanted to clarify that, like, I think I'm looking to not do it all the time and do it like
yeah, you're specifically looking to detect when a session starts, which is basically a transition for right now from 0 to 1 user, and then from 1 back to 0, or from any number.
That still would be, I mean, Brendan, you just described the webhook functionality that we have talked about. That sounds exactly right? Where you just, as long as you have logic somewhere else that can determine that it's time, then you just fire off a post request, and it'll and attach your data set, and then it'll kick this off. Does that sound right?
In theory, I mean, Abe is the decider of what is right. Also, Rob?
I think that sounds right.
Cool. Then we got to build a webhook thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's for sure. Rob, did you have a thought?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say relative to that, it seems like a webhook trigger would be super useful, but it also kind of sounds like for a case like Abe's, and I can imagine lots of other similar ones, like something that can send a webhook request based on whatever the condition it is you want to monitor might not exist. And if I get to the point where I'm like, oh, I have to write another little service that's going to sit there and do that to ping this, I'm like, do I really want to use this to do the other part of it? Like, I may as well just figure out how to like,
do it on the in custom code land
interface and just go to town on whatever thing I'm doing that's doing the monitoring. So part of me makes me wonder, like, is there anything from a recipe to like explicit support that you could have for some kind of like polling type thing that can keep a little bit of state, or even a webhook that can keep a little bit of state, like that's not because what you really have here is you need some state to transition, right? To know like, oh, I had 2 users last time I checked and I've got 0 now, so like good to go, like, but you don't want that state to be part of your data set. And is there like a recipe you could provide where you have like some stupid working data set that you never really want to publish in a meaningful way, but it's just they're keeping state, or like a very simple state store that this thing could have to support like doing that kind of thing or something like that?
Yeah, you're talking about moving code into the triggers, basically having a trigger that can maintain logic of its own. Maybe
yeah, it could be
a polling interval. Yeah.
Or it could even be like this, you might set that up like this is a really frequent cron. I mean, this goes back to Abe saying like, it feels like it's more data interchange than necessary, but I'm not sure how else you'd do it if your sort of like original service that you're trying to get stuff out of can't trigger you because it's not under your control and it doesn't have that feature. Where you could pull really often in like some part of the, like your download step or something somewhere in there has access to this little bit of state from last time or the last few times or whatever. And so it could just stop, right? You could just break. You'd be like, nope, like same state as before, like bail and stop doing the rest of the work versus keeping. That would be the simplest thing. That way the code's not like in the trigger. But I can also imagine like coded triggers. That would be cool. But that gets pretty complicated fast, I think.
I think I wasn't listening to you properly. I think what you just said is much better. Not adding code here, just add code here and see http.get. I would pretend let's schedule this to run every hour. I would do, let's use an old example, epa.gov, and then pretend we have a hash package and we do hash of epa.gov. And then if we had access to a prior version, Dustin has written up a proposal for how we would do that using something called expose. But we would do results, and then if results does not equal prior, again, let's pretend we have a prior results, just like figured out. We actually already have error and unchanged, and we could use a special error message to give you, yeah, I failed, but not in a bad way. and then now you have exactly what you're describing. So we already have the error directive, which allows you to just say a script is in a broken state. But what we would basically need is a type of error that doesn't give you red warnings, but instead gives you the same functionality as unchanged, which you only can get right now if the whole thing runs, completes, and the data actually exactly matches the prior version. Really interesting.
Yeah. Sorry, can you talk more about what prior result is in this that you were just thinking of?
This example?
Yeah.
And so this reminds me a lot of React's memoization techniques of basically you'd need access to a prior version. So we could do, in this example, we could do ctx.getPrev version.
But you're still comparing it to another version of the data set, which I don't think that's not what Rob was talking about. Rob was talking, right?
About a piece of state versus a data set version.
Yeah, like ideally I want somewhere to store some state that is not in the data set I'm producing or working with here. And like the least fun, but like most with the platform seems like that would be another data set that I just never really want to publish.
Yeah.
But like it would be nice and convenient if it weren't even that, because it's not really, it doesn't have to be like seriously reliable state.
Mm-hmm.
Like if it dies every once in a while and it's like, too bad you don't have state from last time, that's probably okay. I don't know. Yeah.
Could you give an example use case of the sort of state you're talking about?
Well, I mean, the generating idea was what Abe was talking about, and I don't know, Abe, if we've gone way off track from what you were dealing with.
I can give you, the state is basically some external information and not caring about how you obtain that information, but using that as the mechanism for the trigger. Is that a general way to say, Rob, what you took from what I said?
Yeah, I think like to do a concrete example from what you were saying, the way I heard it from you is like the state might be number of users in the game space. And so if the previous state was greater than 0 and the now state is 0, I know game over, like time to record stats and continue, versus if the previous state was 0 and this state is 0, or the previous state was greater than 0 and this is still greater than 0, then I just bail out right at the start.
Yeah, I mean, Chris's suggestion though was saying that, that's something that you could do on the other side. And I get why you would maybe not want to allow this, although I think it would probably result in a lot of different use cases that we can't even imagine. But I don't know what the downside is to allowing this sort of flexibility.
Dustin, did you have a thought?
I guess the thing I was gonna like kind of quander on is it really a question of like having state that is differentiating, a previous run versus the current one, or if it's like you need an external trigger that is hitting something. I don't know, I'm not sure. But like kind of related, but kind of different also is I think like, at least with HTTP, we should be like capturing results so we can at least tell when something is different from the last time an endpoint was hit. Like it's something we've talked about, but like haven't gotten started working on. But as long as we're depending on external web services for determining whether your inputs are the same, like have a way of like, seeing what this URL returns at this moment in time. And then if it's the same as it was, like, I don't think it needs to be code written in Starlark land. It should be like part of the system that's doing that. And it also provides a nice way to be like, well, it worked before, and you can kind of have query prove through signatures or something that like, at some point this endpoint returned this data, and we can have some reliance on like the history of the data set where it came from.
I guess what I'm sort of saying or thinking there is that often in a scenario where I'm pulling data from some other service that's outside of my control, which is the reason I'm doing this instead of something else, I think in many cases, at least, I may only care about one aspect of the thing I'm getting back. And so I'm not sure what way the system could usefully automatically determine that nothing has changed, because I might only care about whether one part of the thing has changed. And also it's not about whether it changed, it's whether it changed in a particular way, right? So like in this number of users use case, if it went from 2 to 1, I still don't care, right? And so like, I'm not sure, it feels to me like the question of like should I do the main body of the work part is like, where I'm going with it, I guess, is I feel like there are many scenarios where that is a fairly custom or detailed question that you couldn't just magically answer for me.
One of the ways we're kind of set up to handle that, and I don't know if this should be like an explicitly encouraged practice, but like maybe, is if the output of the download step is the same as it was before, we can know that the transform step will get the same result, because the download step, the only input is like, the URLs that are actually external services. we could kind of encourage people to say like, download isn't just which URLs you're hitting, it's extracting the data you care about from those URLs and then doing as little as possible beyond that. And that way we can kind of see like, if the only thing you care about is this value in this JSON blob, we can then treat it as a dependency and then do like diffing against what we saw last time.
Sure. I guess what I'm thinking about here, that is why I don't immediately go there, is like another example use case to move away from Abe's case is like the environmental enforcement watch stuff that Edu's doing, where we pull down like 8 or more gigabytes of data when we update it, and it gets updated in a irregular fashion. Like we don't necessarily know what time, because there's some manual process on the EPA end for when it all happens. So like updated sometime between 4 and 10 p.m. each day. And so like it is much easier to like pull down a manifest page that says like last update date and figure out whether that has changed before we try and pull down 8 gigabytes of data and decide whether that has changed.
Yeah, and I think there's two conversations happening at once here. There's the question, Dustin, you're talking a lot about caching, and then I think what you're talking about, Rob and Abe, is sort of making the monitoring process more customizable, so that you can actually say, hey, I have some knowledge about when this thing should actually run. If we embed that directly in versions, then if we were to look back at that activity feed, every time that no changes happened in the activity, there actually might have been changes, or there might be something that you want to do that says, no, I will tell you when to make a new version. Just trust me on this. I've got some logic here, and that, but you need access to the last observation, not necessarily the last revision, if I understand this correctly. So I wrote up some like pseudocode around this because we have like this CTX concept, which is our context for executing stuff. CTX ends up being the place that we put in store values. We're trying desperately to get rid of this API, but it keeps coming up with reasons for existing. But in this case, this get state would be different from the actual version control side of things. It would basically be whenever you last called set state. And so in this case, I would do set state. If the number of users is less than the previous number of users, we now know that we're going to bail, but just before we bail, we update the state of that and say, hey, record the change. That's not a version change. The data set is errored, but keep that information around so that I can hone in closer and closer on when I should actually run. This is sort of proxying the session detection. It's not elegant in the sense that it would still need, this is still mimicking the sort of paradigm that Rob is talking about, where you don't actually control the game server. If you control the game server, so you can have it kick things off at the right time. And the smart thing to do whenever you control the whole sort of ecosystem is to make the change at the place where it's the easiest to know. And so the right thing to do here would be to set up a webhook if you even needed a service like this. But in a situation where, as an example, in Rob's example, where it's like the last updated timestamp, we could have that do an HTTP get to, downloads page. And then now we're going to do some scraping to just extract that one piece of HTML and use that string as the thing we're going to pivot on before we actually go and fetch the 8 gig zip file. Yeah, is that, Dustin?
One other thing I wanted to add. One of the reasons for introducing steps also was to have the possibility of like multiple download steps. And with that, you could kind of have one being dependent on the other. And what I was mentioning about before isn't, it's caching in a way, but it's not like for performance sake. It's also because you end up with like easy dependency management when you do it that way. And you could do exactly that use case, like first one that gets a manifest, and then Qrimatic itself is seeing it knows what you got last time, and it can just bail out if it finishes with that same manifest. So
totally. And to your point, we could play with the return value here, and have that sort of tie into some of what you were saying.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of knobs to tweak here.
Many.
I'm curious about your collective feelings about these two cases. So, and there's a definite argument for something like what I'm doing to use a webhook, but at the same time, the game server that I'm running on for testing purposes and I guess you could call it production is stable. It exists. It's not ephemeral, and the stats files live there. And so you could make the argument that that's a perfect place to like init a query. I don't know what you call it, like a repository, but that's I guess that's what it feels like to me. So you could do either one, but the fact that it's not ephemeral, what do you gain in this scenario from having the full query setup versus just using the webhook?
Yeah, so the thing you gain is your local, right? So there's no, I think that if you have the power to just bring query into the game server, I don't think you're going to lose a ton. The thing you'll gain here that we're finding a whole bunch of folks, whenever they stand up their own service, this is the part that snags most people, is sending email and that kind of stuff of like setting up and configuration and additional work around getting up a transactional email server and like doing basic notifications on, hey, this data set changed and now you want to take some action on the basis of that. And that's the number of folks we've talked to who have been like, yeah, I set up my own system to like automate stuff. And then I stopped when it came to like actually just sending emails to the people that cared about it. And so the advantage of going the webhook route where you write a webhook, send it somewhere that is longstanding and has bothered to get a DKIM record and has a transactional email service. And then you can just click and flip on the send an email trigger on completion, which we will have done the work for you. Yay. Now that does mean that comes with the cost of like running on someone else's infrastructure and everything associated with that. We're very much of the mind that you should be fully able to do both, right? And in a situation where you're just running it locally, like, Abe, if you want to do that, to me, like as an engineer, that's the more elegant solution. If I don't need to send email, it's like just run it locally, keep it locally, and you have some massive advantages that way. You've built an application that is largely self-contained. If you want to, you could expose the IPFS part of query, and now your data can back itself up in really easy ways. And you can be a part of that node, or you can just, because you're controlling the node externally, you can have it just push that same data to somewhere else, which will effectively use it as a backup service. But yeah, I think your instinct of putting query onto the game server and doing the versioning right there and leveraging that and the second part of what you're sort of alluding to was actually being able to use query's log to drive information back the other way. You have no network round trip if you do it that way in your data store. Your data is now co-located with your application. And so that'll be a far more reliable experience. You don't have to worry about APIs being down or anything. That's just running locally. The trade-off is you're now managing your own infrastructure, but it sounds like you're doing that anyways. So that's basically where the dividing line tends to be for folks. It's like, do you want to manage your own infra? If you do, then you have many options. But if you don't, then you get email and websites instead of SSH clients and configuration. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the email thing's really cool. It'd be cool to have both, like going through the trouble of making the game server self-sufficient, but then also getting to take advantage of some of the like, hey, this thing is done and now we can send an email on your behalf. Like that
yeah. I think it'd be eminently doable if you just we'll have completion set up for hooks as well. So if you did query push this to there, and then it basically says every time I receive a new version, send that email. Now you have the best of both worlds, right? You're doing two things at once. You're setting a backup of your data to an external service, and you are potentially invoking completion hooks whenever that happens. And so they're totally pluralizable. I think it's the question of using the right tool for the job. Rob, what do you think? Are we headed in the right direction?
I think it seems pretty cool. I have to go to another meeting now. if you can say quickly, and I hope this isn't opening up another can of worms, the part that wasn't clear to me here is like where exactly the various pieces of this are running.
Mhm.
So like, is this a web service that like query is going to run kind of like query cloud? Is this like a thing that is integrated into the query binary that it spins up a little server that I can go play with this on? Is this a whole separate service that I should deploy on my own somewhere? That part was not clear to me.
Totally. So starting with the second, or starting with the first, then the second, then the third, you hit the order.
Okay.
So we're launching this as a service that people can play with first, and then we'll fold this into Query Core so that it'll be something you play with and run locally. But the last step, that like the email configuration setup, running the last bit of being able to like run stuff, run the scheduler on your own locally is the last sort of thing that we'd ship. And that, I mean, the earliest that'll happen will be late, very far into 2021. Cool. I don't want to keep anyone past 3. Thank you so much, Abe, for joining, Rob for joining. Yeah, thank you for your feedback. Abe, if you need any help setting up any of that, we would be delighted. We know it's just a side project, but